Dear listeners, the burnout conversation has been almost, entirely psychological. We talk about stress, we talk about boundaries, talk about mindset. We tell people to rest more, to reframe their thinking, and to find meaning in their work. And people try, they do the journaling, they take the breaks, they see the therapist, and they are still exhausted, still foggy, still unable to access the clarity or drive that used to feel effortless. So the question comes, I believe all of you are also thinking about it. Like, what if that's not because the psychological tools are not working? What if it's because burnout is not primarily a psychological problem at all? I think I have made all of you a bit of confused. So let's not get confused. Today's guest is going to change how you think about your own energy permanently. So, here, dear listeners, welcome back to another powerful episode of Mind Meets Machine, where we refuse to accept the surface level explanation when a deeper one is available. I'm your host, Avik, and I'm really glad that all of you are here today. And my guest today is a globally recognized functional medicine practitioner specializing in neuroendoimmunology, genetics, and mitochondrial health. So he addresses the complex multifactorial conditions through highly individualized root cause approaches, and his work helps patients restore the energy, resilience, and the function that when conventional care has run out of the answers. So, wait to wait. Let's get started, and please welcome our guest, Dr. Jess Amine. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Amazing, amazing. So, Dr. Jess, like before we get into the science, I want to ask about the clinical reality. Like in your practice, you work with people who have been often even through the conventional systems without resolution. What does that patient typically look like when they first arrive?
My practice is total made up of complex multifactorial illnesses, and the key is that have not gotten help elsewhere. Just the basic break is the way that things are looked at. As your diagnosis. Okay, you're an OCD person, you're an ADD person, you have chronic fatigue. You become that person rather than looking at not only root causes, but the combination of what started it to what led to the expression that whatever your diagnosis is. And let me tell you something. Most diagnoses are not diagnoses. Okay. I know I'm going to get it for this, but a diagnosis should point to a root cause. I'll give you an example. If you have a sore throat, that's a symptom. If you have strep throat, now I know why you have the sore throat. If you have OCD or anxiety or ADD, that's a list of symptoms. It doesn't tell me why. And unfortunately, taking it from that point of view and doing a pharmaceutical or nutraceutical protocol based on that has its, shall we say, difficulties because you're not shooting at the right target. Okay. If we're going to talk about burnout, okay, burnout, first off, I agree with you. It's not purely psychological. Okay. As a matter of fact, the psychological portion comes after the problems happen, as a result of the problems. It's a mitochondrial, neurochemical, inflammatory, and metabolic problem. What does that mean? Your mitochondria are your energy producers, they're like your batteries, okay, in whatever, okay? And nothing heals without energy. Neurochemical simply means that, and neurochemical and inflammatory, you mentioned neuroendoimmunology. The way we balance ourselves is by a relationship between the nervous system, the hormone system, and the immune system, because they constantly talk to one another. And that crosstalk, is how we balance ourselves. But when one goes off rather significantly, then another one's going to go off. Then the third one's going to go off. So when we talk about, let's say, somebody who's a high achiever, a high performer, they get burnt out because they've been working years and living on their stress hormones. By the way, there's not an inexhaustible supply of those. Okay? There's not an inexhaustible supply of your neurotransmitters that create your moods. They can burn out, which means they can get empty and become dysfunctional. And you don't have what you need for nerve transmission or to create a normal mental state. Okay. So if we look at the underlying cellular dysfunction, okay, we can start looking at a reason and a pathway to healing. Now, I've been a healthcare provider for about 5 decades, exactly 5 decades, as a matter of fact. And I've been a paramedic. I was a registered nurse, emergency department, critical care, I've been a chiropractor, and I've been doing all this. And I'm certified in loads of different areas: genetics, the neuroendocrinology, mitochondrial dysfunction, And I could go on and on and on, but I don't want, you shouldn't be impressed that I've got lots of stuff in my CV, but what you should be impressed with is the fact that I can put this together for you. When I started doing this, people would come to me with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune diseases, ADD, autisms, and all these varied things. And I interview people for a long time and take a good history. And I noticed there was one factor that was either not treated or not considered or not treated with its proper weight, and that was the function of the cell itself. I called it fundamental treatment or foundational treatment, the foundation of the body. You may see that these days in something called terrain treatment or bioterrain treatment. Okay. I invented it, so to speak. In other words, I got the stuff together and I started beating my colleagues with it, and they laughed at me for like decades. And then all of a sudden now you're saying, hey, we've got to treat the cells. I'm like, okay, I wonder where you heard that before, I don't hold on to my knowledge. I give it out freely because this has to change. There's no Dr. Jess method out there. Okay. What we're going to talk about is the way what is the stone left unturned, if you will. Okay. So because of different things like illnesses or toxins or microbes, or believe it or not, all the psychological, spiritual, and emotional traumas, okay, will injure a cell in equal measure, usually a combination of things. And when that starts happening, your mitochondria, your energy cells can't produce the energy. And the more you stress it over time, the more you stress whatever system over time, it's going to become dysfunctional. At first, it'll overreact, and then all of a sudden, it will just, if you will, give up the ghost. And when that happens is when you start getting symptoms that appear to be different conditions. And yes, there are inflammatory conditions. Why some people go to autoimmune, why do some people go to neuropsychiatric? That depends on your genetic predisposition. Your genes are not sitting there waiting in the tall grass to get you. Okay, the genes, the different pathways, which I'm also an expert in,
Mhm.
may or may not be fully functional. If you look at them, then you say to yourself, okay, if there's think of it as traffic. Okay, think of it the normal as being an 8-lane highway, something called the heterozygous gene being a 4-lane highway, and homozygous being a 2-lane highway. If there's no traffic, what's the big deal? Okay, everything will start working. But when you start putting traffic in, obviously the 2-lane highway is going to block up faster than the whole 4-lane. And can you have enough traffic to block up an 8-lane highway? Absolutely. What's the traffic? And oxidative stress, allergies, and the toxins, and so forth and so on and so on. That's what causes wherever the glitches are is the direction you're going to head to have symptoms. If you think about it, if you go back to the cellular function, which is what originates all that, aren't you going to start reversing some of this stuff, either completely or at least partially? That's what I discovered. It was there. I mean, it's like physics.
Hmm.
We don't discover physics. It's there. We're just catching up to the universe. It's okay.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, when I started looking at the cellular function, the foundation of the body, and started giving the body what it needed in an absorbable form, the body was saying, hey, okay, thank you very much. And it started rebuilding itself. And I've got some great examples of how that happened, what the result was in very serious cases. So I would not only look at root causes like Lyme disease and I would look at different things that may have not been considered. And the way you find that out is by taking a good history. You can see where the glitches are, but what it did to the body. And the expression of it, which is what everybody's worried about, chronic illness, the decline, so forth and so on, that's the result of this stuff. Now, sometimes medications help mitigate it. In other words, hold on to it, so that doesn't get worse, but you still have to treat the inside.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. And here I definitely would love to ask about burnout is bioenergetic. Like, and let's go to the right to the claim that I think will stop a lot of people mid scroll that burnout is not psychological, it's bioenergetic. And that's a
Yes, it is.
significant reframe, right? So, I mean, if you can share, like, what does that mean? I mean, what is the evidence base that makes you confident enough to say it directly?
Burnout, the word burnout
Hmm,
means fatigue, sometimes depression, and all
hmm,
those different symptoms
yeah.
can be from burnout. If you look at the list of symptoms for burnout, you're going to see almost the same symptoms as oxidative stress or same symptoms as a lot of other stuff. Clinically, burnout is a combination of maybe dopamine depletion, chondral dysfunction, oxidative stress, nervous system overload, chronic inflammation, stress adaptation. You can't out discipline a broken cellular energy production. So burnout is a lack of energy. So if we look at, and I could go through tons of scientific evidence And I'm just going to confuse everybody. But one of the ways of doing this, if you're listening, is use your intuitive sense. If what I'm saying makes sense to you on a internal basis,
Yeah.
I could, if you go to my YouTube channel, which is Dr. Jess Amine, you're going to see loads of videos on different things. Scientific evidence is there if you're very interested. I've written a paper recently that was published that, was very scientific about long COVID, but things that injure the cell. Now, where's the scientific evidence for that? Dr. Robert Navio, MD, PhD, wrote a paper in 2013, Features of the Cell Danger Response. What that is how your cells respond to an attack. And he divided into the things that will injure a cell that are proven on a scientific basis are toxins, which I don't think anybody would argue about toxins, microbes, parasites, and viruses, and so forth. But he also proved on an acceptable scientific basis, a peer-reviewed scientific basis, that the emotional, psychological, and spiritual traumas that we face injure the cell in equal measure. There are studies that show that depression and anger will develop inflammation. It develops pro-inflammatory cytokines. When I say something fast, people ignore it. Okay, please ignore it because I don't want you to sit there and say, "What the heck is a cytokine?" Doesn't matter. Okay, what matters is that's what creates inflammation. But those emotions. Now, it also way back in 1936, Hans Selye posited and proved that if somebody is depressed, they caught colds easier. Okay, depression and anger and anxiety dampen down the immune system and allow other things to come in. So there's a ton of scientific evidence. All we've done is unpack it so that we could look at the various functions. So if you have dopamine depletion, it's a two-phase thing. One, your enzymes that lead to dopamine may not be working very well because they don't have what they need to work. The base amino acids that create it, you may not be absorbing from your gut because you've got a bad gut. And that's going to lead, and then you're overusing the dopamine because of a high stress environment. So eventually, if you're using it and you're not getting a lot, it's very logical. Your mitochondria need certain things to work, certain vitamins and minerals, but they also have to get these things called electron donors put in there that get rendered and create energy, which is ATP. What does that is how you get your energy. Glucose becomes lactic acid and goes into this big thing called a Krebs cycle, which is a honking amount of biochemical processes that end up in the production of these electron donors. Then coenzyme Q10 bring it to the mitochondria. Problems in that pathway, which is fairly common, means that you're not going to get enough electron donors. And this can all be from oxidative stress over time. The great example I give is when people have depression, doctors automatically put them on an SSRI, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. What does that do? Okay, it doesn't produce serotonin. In the nerves, there are synapses, okay? And in the nerve, you have these little storage houses called vesicles. Let's say serotonin is needed. So it goes down, releases some serotonin, goes over to the other side, goes onto the receptor, and after it delivers its message, it pops off and either hangs out with its buddies, gets broken down, or gets reabsorbed to be reused. Well, over time, when you have a lot of stress and you're using a lot of serotonin to combat dopamine, what's going to happen is eventually those little vesicles are going to start getting empty. At some point, they give you a reuptake inhibitor, which temporarily holds on to more serotonin, but it does nothing for the production. And that's why those medicines fail. If we look at where the serotonin gets produced, which is in your gut, 80% of it, and we start extrapolating back and say, let's look at the gut and fix it, you have to be able to digest your foods to get the base amino acids. And that's what supplies the manufacturer. That's where the big divide is. Okay, we're going to treat this. We're going to, hold on, we're going to treat the receptors, but does nothing for the actual production. And that's what I've been preaching in the way that I practice is, okay, if you tell me your medicines, I can tell you exactly what's going on physiologically, but I'm going to fix your ability to digest your foods, to absorb your foods, to give your biochemical processes what they need to work, and also look at the causations and the downstream effects and treat them specifically in order to get the cell to work. Because remember, put cells together, what do you get? Tissues. Put tissues together, what do you get? Organs. Put organs together, you have a body. So if you don't look at it from the very base, people don't get better. This has been ubiquitous. In other words, very common in chronic illnesses that haven't gotten successful help elsewhere. And that's one of the ways of looking at it. Now, it can get really, 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 really complex. If you go Google. Dr. Google is my nemesis, by the way. But just put in chronic inflammation causes, and you'll see these little charts that show chronic inflammation causing things like autoimmune diseases, blah, 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 blah. That's the base of it. Start bringing that down, giving
Mm.
your body what it needs to work. Many of these things go away. Maybe not completely, because it's even more complex. But everybody has to realize they're not broken. What you have is not permanent. You can get your body to work. And this is where my studies have been, it gets, like I said, very interactive because we're not separate systems. We're an interactive system. But that's the base of it. If you work on the base, things often take care of themselves to a certain degree. It takes more than that, of course.
Amazing. Amazing. And neuroendoimmunology, the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system in conversation with each other. So, what is happening across those three systems in someone who presents with what looks like burnout, chronic fatigue,
Mhm.
or I'd say persistent anxiety?
Okay. I did a lecture in Ireland on the gut-brain axis and its relationship to neurodiversity, things like ADD, ADHD, autism. And just to give you one leg of that, in the gut, there's signaling that goes on. Think of it as Morse code, okay, going back and forth.
Mm.
And because they constantly talk to one another, if the gut is dysfunctional, the normal signaling doesn't happen. And then in the nervous system, its receptors and signaling gets all off. And guess what? You start getting imbalances in the neurotransmitters, which cause mood issues or, mood disorders or thought disorders. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is looking at the endocrine system, the hormone system. And in there, you have the adrenal system. And that's called the HPA axis, the hypopituitary adrenal axis. And that's how you handle your stress.
Mm.
But in that system is also the HPT axis, which is for thyroid, and the HPG axis for gonad or ovaries or testes for men or women.
Yep.
One goes off there, and that whole system goes off. So think about this:
Yep.
H and P are stool, okay? And you had three legs, like they do when you're milking cows and stuff, three legs. And that's balancing almost anywhere. But you shorten the leg, make this one a little weird, okay? And that's going to go off. And then all these other systems are going to go off. The beginning of burnout, when things start getting dysfunctional, go into the other systems, immune system. And if this is causing, usually in the immune system, you're talking leaky gut syndrome and stuff, the origin of inflammation. And if it's not treated, the inflammation gets worse. Your body's using its energy, its resources to fight the inflammation and leaving less for you to repair, heal, and live your life. So the relationships are not all that complex. They can be pretty simple
Mm.
if you think about it. But when one starts going off and we allow that to happen because we're not feeling it or whatever, once it starts getting worse and worse and worse, you start getting symptoms, and then it's affecting other systems. And that's why it has to be looked at like a big picture thing. Okay. Concentrate on the mitochondria because it's how you produce energy. But fixing what you do to fix a cell is what you do to fix mitochondria because they're basically a little cell within the cell. Actually, mitochondria is not native to our genome. It was a bacteria that invaded our cells during evolution. And the reason it liked us is because we produced lactic acid and it likes lactic acid. Okay. So we were giving it energy and it said, okay, I'll hang out with you. The fact is that if you go through the whole system between glycolysis and all the way out, you get 38 ATPs per unit of glucose. But if you didn't have the mitochondrial function, you'd only get 2 ATPs per unit of glucose. Then your body would start screaming it wants more sugar, which would produce more acid. So it really gets, it gets a little complex,
Amazing.
but not much. And believe it or not, once things start going off, you start getting you start having feelings. If you have depression for a reason, that's called situational depression. Anxiety for a reason, that's situational anxiety. In other words, you break up with a significant other, you're going to be sad for a while, that's appropriate. But when you have these feelings for no identifiable reason, what you end up doing is backfilling in. In other words, filling something in there because you don't want to be crazy. And guess what? That becomes, that keeps on going and going. Then you go to your physicians who are treating the end result. They're not treating why it happened or the pathway of it or what could be causing it now. You start thinking that way and people get better. So burnout is a multifactorial condition that is a result of long-term stress of all ilk. And remember, if it's psychological stress, it's going to injure the cell as well. Chronic inflammation and the failure of the body to adapt. It doesn't compensate. Up until we get sick, our body is compensating for whatever's going on. You don't even know what's going on. But once you enter a phase of decompensation, that's when you get symptoms. Our
Mm.
bodies are really cool. They're trying to adapt to everything. The reason that they may not adapt is because they don't have what they need to adapt. It's not a simple solution, but it is the conceptually it works.
Amazing. And today, for the listeners, if you have to give one advice, what that to be?
If I were going to give somebody just one piece of advice, if you have a chronic illness and you're frustrated as heck, I want you to understand that you are not broken. Okay, I want you to step back, look at everything that's gone on, and you feel like you've done everything, but maybe not. Maybe you could sit back and say, And once you get the idea that you can heal, you'll begin the process of healing. A lot of stuff really does require professional guidance, but the first thing you can do is take like liposomal multivitamins, which will get directly into your cells, and they're not expensive anymore. You can look at different ways of treating a leaky gut, which almost everybody who's got a chronic illness has. And if you treat it and it happens not to be there, which is rare, but you're not going to hurt yourself because the treatment of it is very benign and will slow down the production of inflammation. A lot of this stuff is almost counterintuitive. It's almost too simple. That's why we had so much trouble with it. It doesn't have a fancy name. It doesn't have a sexy name. And what we look for is the complex or the
Mm.
protocol, the nice big fancy name with the good looking doctor, it's got the round glasses and stuff like that. But they forget the simple stuff. And when they
Yeah.
do treat it, a lot of times they treat it either incompletely or without knowledge. In other words, here's a multivitamin, no thought to absorption. So if anything, I would tell you, you're not broken. If you're sitting up looking at me, you're fixable. It's just a matter of stepping back and saying, okay, let me do some research. Let me contact somebody who may know what they're doing, and get some counseling, not counseling, psychological counseling, but someone who can put all this stuff together. My tagline is putting the health puzzle together. Okay, and that's what I do.
Amazing. And if someone wants to connect with you, what will be the great medium?
Well, it's easy. You can go to my website, which is drjessamine.com. You can
Mhm.
go to YouTube, Dr. Jess Amine, and you'll see lots of videos that explain a lot of this stuff. And if you want to join me on Instagram, Dr. Jess Amine 724, which is my birthday. If you wanted to have a conversation with me, if you go to my website on the bottom left-hand side, you can click Get Acquainted, which will allow you to schedule a free 30-minute consultation. What we do there is we sit down together and we chat and see what's going on. And I can tell you in no uncertain terms whether I can help you or not. And then I leave it up to you whether you want to work with me. Okay. But we also want to see if we get along. Okay. Because everything is a relationship. A good relationship with your doctor, you're going to start healing because it's a matter of trust. So that's how people can get in touch with me.
Amazing. So, dear listeners, what I'll do is I'll put all the links and the details into the show notes for the easy reference. And with this, I'd say that's the wrap for today's episode on Mind Meets Machine. And if this conversation named something that you have been living with but couldn't explain, the exhaustion, the fog, the loss of clarity or the purpose that didn't respond to the things that were supposed to help. So please take that seriously. And the answer may not be in your mind, it may be in your mitochondria. So, as I mentioned, Raja's details will be there in the show notes. And if someone in your life has been burnt out without resolution, this episode was made for them. With this hope, this is the host of again. This is Mind Meets Machine. Definitely love to say that energy is not a luxury. It's the foundation of everything, including the clarity, meaning, and the life that you came here to live. So take care of yourselves. See you next time. Thank you so much.